Morning light filters through the California haze, casting long shadows across the quiet suburban streets of Hayward. It's the kind of morning that promises nothing unusual. Neighbors retrieve newspapers from driveways. Coffee makers gurgle in kitchens. The world turns as it always does, predictable and safe. But for 74-year-old John Arthur Gautreau, standing at his doorway in casual clothes, preparing for another ordinary day, this morning will be different. This morning will shatter the carefully constructed life he spent decades building, brick by methodical brick. The woman at his door seems genuinely distressed. Her face carries that universal expression of embarrassment and concern that comes with minor accidents. She's hit his car, she explains, her voice apologetic. A simple fender bender in his driveway. These things happen. Would he mind stepping outside to take a look? Perhaps they should exchange insurance information. Sort this out like reasonable adults? John doesn't hesitate. Why would he? He's a homeowner, a responsible citizen. These minor inconveniences are just part of life. He steps outside into the cool morning air, perhaps thinking about what this might cost him, whether his insurance rates will increase, the hassle of getting repairs done. He has no idea that he's walking directly into a trap that's been 45 years in the making. The moment he approaches his vehicle, his world implodes. Badges appear from nowhere, glinting in the morning sun. Strong hands grip his shoulders from multiple directions. Commands ring out in the quiet morning air, shattering the suburban peace. Face the car, hands behind your back. Don't move. The cold metal of handcuffs bites into his wrists. In the span of perhaps 10 seconds, John Arthur Gautreau transforms from a concerned homeowner into a suspect in custody. The undercover officer's ruse has worked perfectly, executed with the precision that comes from careful planning and coordination. His neighbors, if they're watching from behind their curtains, must be shocked. That nice older man being arrested? There must be some mistake. But there is no mistake. As deputies conduct a routine pat-down, checking for weapons or contraband, and guide him toward a waiting police vehicle, John does something that catches the officers off guard. Something that, in hindsight, reveals far more than he realizes. He compliments them on their tactics. Good strategy, he tells them almost admiringly. Smart way to get someone out of their house. Clever approach. His voice carries no anger, no indignation, no confusion. Just a sort of professional appreciation, as if he's evaluating their technique. His calm demeanor is deeply unsettling, almost as if he'd been expecting this moment. As if, somewhere in the back of his mind, he'd always known it would come. As if he'd been waiting for it, rehearsing in his head how he might react when the day finally arrived. But waiting for what, exactly? What does an innocent man have to fear from a knock on his door? The officers exchange glances. They've arrested countless people over their careers. They've seen every reaction imaginable. Rage, fear, confusion, tears, protests of innocence, demands for lawyers. But calm acceptance? Professional admiration for the ruse that caught them? That's unusual. That's the reaction of someone who understands the game because they've been playing it for a very long time. To understand this moment, we need to travel back in time. Back to the quiet, climate-controlled evidence rooms of Santa Clara County, where the past is preserved in boxes and bags, carefully labeled and cataloged. Where unsolved mysteries wait in the darkness, hoping that someday someone will remember them. Months before that knock on John's door, cold case investigators had pulled a file that had been gathering dust for nearly half a century. The cardboard was yellowed with age. The photographs inside had faded slightly. The typewritten reports were created on machines that no longer existed. Inside that file was a mystery that had haunted the community since 1973. A young woman's life, brutally ended in the hills above Stanford University. A killer who had vanished into the years like morning fog, leaving behind only questions and grief. For decades, that case had been worked and reworked. Investigators had followed leads that went nowhere. They'd interviewed suspects who had alibis. They'd developed theories that couldn't be proven. Eventually, as newer cases demanded attention and the original investigators retired or passed away, the file was closed. Not solved. Just closed. The family learned to live with uncertainty. They buried their daughter without knowing who had taken her from them. They marked birthdays she would never celebrate. They grew older while she remained forever 21 in their memories. But something changed in those evidence rooms. Something revolutionary. DNA technology had advanced beyond anything investigators in the 70s could have imagined. What was once science fiction had become routine police work. The genetic material recovered from that decades-old crime scene, carefully preserved but seemingly useless for so many years, could now speak across time itself. The biological evidence was submitted for modern testing. The DNA profile was extracted and compared against public databases. Not just criminal databases, but the genealogy websites where millions of people had voluntarily uploaded their genetic information, hoping to find distant cousins or trace their ancestral roots. They had no idea they were also building a tool for justice. Family trees were traced, branches were followed. Second cousins and third cousins were identified. The web of relationships was mapped out with painstaking care. And at the end of one particular branch, investigators found a name that made them pause. John Arthur Gautreau. On the surface, he seemed unremarkable, a 74-year-old retiree living quietly in the Bay Area suburbs. Married, father, former Boy Scout leader who had worked with young people. The kind of elderly gentleman you might see at the grocery store or the hardware store going about his business, bothering no one. But as investigators began digging into his background, running his name through databases and searching old records, something disturbing emerged from the depths of time. This wasn't John's first encounter with accusations of murder. Not even close. In fact, his past was littered with red flags that should have been impossible to ignore. The question hanging over the investigation was simple yet profound. Was this elderly man simply the victim of a tragic mistake? His DNA coincidentally matching through some astronomical fluke? Or had his entire adult life been nothing more than an elaborate disguise, a carefully maintained mask concealing something far more sinister beneath the surface? As investigators compiled their evidence and built their case, one thing became clear. They couldn't arrest John based solely on DNA evidence without more information. They needed to talk to him. They needed to hear his story. They needed to watch how he reacted to questions he couldn't possibly have anticipated. They needed to look into his eyes when they confronted him with the truth. And so, on that ordinary California morning, the undercover operation was executed. The fake accident, the friendly approach, the moment of surprise. John Arthur Gautreau was no longer a free man, and the secrets he'd carried for decades were about to be exposed to the light. The interrogation room is designed to be unremarkable. Plain walls, uncomfortable chairs, a table bolted to the floor, fluorescent lights that hum constantly, creating a subtle psychological pressure through their artificial brightness. There are no windows, no clocks, nothing to orient you in time or space. It's a room designed for truth extraction. John sits across from Sergeant Cortez, his posture remarkably relaxed despite the circumstances. His hands rest calmly on the table. His breathing is even. He doesn't fidget or avoid eye contact. To an untrained observer, he might seem like someone who has nothing to hide. But Sergeant Cortez is far from untrained. He's conducted hundreds of these interviews. He knows that excessive calm can be just as suspicious as excessive nervousness. Guilty people often overcompensate, trying to appear relaxed when they should be confused or frightened. The sergeant begins with the basics, his tone conversational and non-threatening. Just confirming some information, he explains. Standard procedure. He needs John's full name for the record. John Arthur Gautreau, born in Newark, Ohio. Never served in the military himself, though his father had a long and distinguished career. The family had moved constantly during John's childhood, living on various military bases across the United States, before eventually being stationed overseas. It seemed like ordinary military family life, the kind of upbringing that builds character, teaches adaptability, exposes children to different cultures. John's teenage years were spent in West Germany, living on an American military base while his father served. He would have attended Department of Defense schools, socialized with other military kids, lived in an insulated community of Americans abroad. Nothing unusual in any of that. Thousands of military children had similar experiences. Then Sergeant Cortez's questions take an unexpected turn. His tone doesn't change. His expression remains neutral. But the question lands like a bomb in the quiet room. He mentions an arrest. Something that happened in Germany years ago. Something John had initially claimed didn't exist when asked if he'd ever been arrested. The air in the room shifts subtly. The temperature seems to drop a few degrees. John's expression changes just slightly. A tightening around the eyes. A pause before speaking. The mask slips for just a moment before being carefully repositioned. He admits it. Yes, there had been an arrest in Germany. The memory surfaces slowly, reluctantly, like something that's been deliberately buried under decades of other experiences. Something he'd hoped never to discuss again. He was accused of murder, he says quietly. His voice carries no emotion, just a statement of fact. The revelation drops like a stone into still water, sending ripples outward, because John isn't sitting in this interrogation room for a traffic violation or a financial dispute or some minor infraction. He's here because of another murder accusation, a different victim, a different decade, a different country. But apparently, not his first encounter with such allegations. Sergeant Cortez maintains his neutral expression, but his mind must be racing. One murder accusation could be a terrible miscarriage of justice, but two, separated by decades? That's not coincidence. That's pattern. He needs to know more. Needs to understand what happened in Germany. Needs to hear John's version of events and compare it against the official records. So he asks John to tell him about it. What was the accusation? What were the circumstances? What does John remember about that time? The story John tells transports us back to 1963, to a time when the world was a very different place. The Cold War was at its height. American military personnel were stationed across Europe. Teenagers attended dances at youth clubs on military bases, trying to maintain some semblance of normal American life thousands of miles from home. John was 18 years old, still technically a teenager himself, though legally an adult. He was living on the military base in West Germany with his family, existing in that strange limbo between adolescence and adulthood. One Saturday night, a dance was held at the American Youth Club. These events were common, a way for military families to give their teenagers social opportunities in a controlled environment. Music, dancing, soft drinks and snacks, chaperoned fun. A young American girl attended that dance. Her name was Margaret Williams. She was only 15 years old, with her whole life stretching out ahead of her. She probably wore her best dress. Maybe she danced with friends. Maybe she felt grown up, sophisticated, staying out late at a club. According to the official account that would later emerge, John and Margaret met on the street after the dance ended. The details of their encounter vary depending on who's telling the story. John claims he didn't know her at all, that they were strangers, that someone simply saw him walking in the same direction she went, and that tenuous connection was enough to make him a suspect when tragedy struck. But the prosecution at his trial told a different story. They said John offered to walk Margaret home, that she accepted, that they walked together into the darkness, leaving the lights and safety of the youth club behind. What happened next was discovered the following morning, when someone found Margaret's body on a baseball diamond behind the club. She'd been sexually assaulted. The attack had been violent, brutal, and she'd been strangled, her young life choked away by hands that wouldn't release even as she fought for breath. Her body was left alone in the dirt of that baseball diamond, left for someone to stumble upon in the harsh light of morning. Left like she was nothing, like she mattered so little that her killer couldn't even be bothered to hide what he'd done. The base erupted in horror and fear. A 15-year-old girl, murdered on American military property, a daughter of their community, killed by someone who had walked among them. The investigation was immediate and intense, and it led to 18-year-old John Arthur Getrew. Now sitting in an interrogation room in California decades later, John maintains his innocence in that long-ago crime. He didn't know Margaret, he insists. He wasn't there. He never touched her. Someone simply saw him walking in that general direction after the dance, and in the panic to solve a horrific crime, he became a convenient suspect. The German authorities saw it differently. At trial, witnesses testified. Evidence was presented. The prosecution built their case methodically, and the German court found 18-year-old John Arthur Gertrude guilty of Margaret Williams's murder. The sentence was 10 years in a German juvenile prison. Because of his age and because he was tried as a juvenile, the sentence was relatively lenient compared to what an adult might have received. And because of good behavior or overcrowding, or the various factors that influence prison release decisions, John was let out after serving roughly 6 years. Just 2/3 of his sentence. 6 years for taking a young girl's life. Then he walked free. John describes his release with a strange detachment. His father picked him up at the Air Force Base. They got in the car. They drove away. And according to John, his father never spoke about it again. Not one word about those 6 years. Not one question about what had happened or what John had experienced in that German prison. Just silence. Heavy, oppressive silence that stretched across years. What kind of father doesn't talk to his son about something like that? What kind of family pretends it never happened? Or did his father's silence speak volumes about what he believed actually happened on that baseball diamond? John returned to the United States with his family, and they settled in California. The warm sunshine, the Pacific Ocean, the promise of new beginnings. It was a chance to start over, to leave the past buried on a military base in Germany. A fresh beginning, a clean slate, an opportunity to become someone different, or so it seemed. But some people don't change. Some people carry their darkness with them no matter how many miles they travel or how many years pass. Some people are fundamentally broken in ways that can't be fixed by geography or time. John Arthur Gertrude was about to prove which category he fell into. By 1975, John had established himself in Palo Alto, one of the jewels of the San Francisco Bay Area, home to Stanford University, center of the emerging technology industry, a place of innovation, education, and affluence. John had found his place in this community. He'd gotten involved with the Boy Scouts, specifically working with an Explorer Post. For those unfamiliar, Explorer Posts are programs for older teenagers, focusing on career exploration and leadership development. It's a position of trust. Parents hand over their teenagers, believing they'll be mentored and guided by responsible adults. John was one of those responsible adults, or so everyone believed. Then came another accusation that should have ended his access to young people forever. A teenage girl came forward with a disturbing claim. John, she said, had sexually assaulted her. But it wasn't just a simple assault. According to her account, he'd strangled her during the attack, cutting off her air supply, watching her panic and struggle. And when it was over, he'd threatened to kill her if she ever told anyone what had happened. The level of violence, the strangling specifically, the threats. All of it should have raised enormous red flags, especially for anyone who knew about the German conviction. Sergeant Cortez brings this up carefully in the interrogation, watching John's face for any reaction. How does John explain this accusation? John's response is vague, almost dismissive. He shifts in his chair slightly. His hands move on the table. Nothing happened, he claims. He was questioned by police, yes, but he was never tried. The matter simply disappeared, evaporated. The girl went away. He never saw her again. Case closed. But according to multiple news sources that would later investigate John's background, that's not quite what happened. John was 31 years old when that teenager came forward. He was charged. The case went before a judge, and he was sentenced. 6 months, reduced to 30 days, served on weekends, after 5 months were suspended. 30 days. For sexually assaulting and strangling a teenager, for threatening to kill her. 30 days. The sentence is almost incomprehensible in its leniency. What message does that send to a predator? What lesson does someone like John learn when the consequences for violent assault are barely more than a speeding ticket? He learns that he can get away with it. That's what he learns. And so John moved on with his life once again. The conviction, such as it was, didn't seem to impact him significantly. He got married. He had children. He became a security guard, ironically tasked with keeping people safe. He lived quietly in the Bay Area suburbs, surrounded by neighbors who had no idea about his past. The German murder conviction, ancient history, from when he was barely more than a child himself. The assault conviction, a minor blip, barely worth mentioning. To anyone who didn't know better, John Arthur Gutroy looked like an ordinary middle-aged man living an ordinary life, working, raising a family, paying his bills, mowing his lawn. But beneath that ordinary exterior was something else lurking. Were there other victims? Other attacks that never got reported or investigated? Other young women who encountered John and lived to regret it, or didn't live at all? The investigators in that Santa Clara County cold case unit were about to discover the answer. Now, sitting in the sterile interrogation room, Sergeant Cortez reveals the real reason John has been brought in. The reason for the undercover operation. The reason John's carefully constructed life is about to collapse completely. The sergeant's tone remains conversational, but every word is calculated. He asks if John is familiar with the hills around Stanford University, the hiking trails that wind through the coastal mountains, Page Mill Road, which cuts through the wilderness, the remote areas where students and locals go to enjoy nature, to escape the bustle of campus life, to find peace and solitude. John acknowledges that he knows the area. Of course he does. He was a scout leader for years. He'd hiked those hills countless times with boys under his supervision, teaching them about nature and outdoor skills. He'd probably walked the very trails the sergeant is now asking about. Then Sergeant Cortez shows him a photograph, sliding it across the table. The young woman in the picture is beautiful in that effortless way some people have. Dark hair frames her face. Her eyes are bright with intelligence and humor. She's smiling at whoever took the photo, a genuine smile that reaches her eyes. Looking at this picture, you can tell she was someone special, someone vibrant, someone who loved life and was loved in return. Her name was Leslie Marie Perloff, and in 1973, she was 21 years old, standing at the threshold of adult life with infinite possibilities spread before her. Leslie had graduated from Stanford University, no small feat. Stanford was and remains one of the most prestigious universities in the world. To earn a degree, there required intelligence, dedication, and drive. Leslie had all three. After graduation, she'd taken a position as a law clerk at the North County Law Library in Palo Alto. It was exactly the kind of job a bright young Stanford graduate would pursue, working with law, building professional connections, gaining experience that would serve as a foundation for whatever career path she ultimately chose. Maybe she wanted to become a lawyer herself. Maybe she dreamed of teaching law or working in policy. Maybe she hadn't decided yet and was simply exploring her options as young people do. She should have had years to figure it out, decades to pursue her dreams, to make mistakes and learn from them, to become whoever she was meant to be. Instead, her life was cut brutally short. Leslie's body was found dumped in the Stanford Dish hiking area, a popular trail system in the hills above the university. The Dish refers to a large radio telescope operated by Stanford, and the surrounding area is crisscrossed with trails that offer stunning views of the Bay Area. It's beautiful there, peaceful, the kind of place where you feel connected to nature and distant from the problems of the world below. It became Leslie's tomb. Her body bore the signs of sexual assault. Someone had attacked her, violated her, treated her like an object rather than a human being. And when he was finished, when he'd taken what he wanted, he'd killed her. A floral scarf had been tied tightly around her neck, fashioned into a ligature. The killer had pulled it tight, watching as Leslie struggled for air that wouldn't come. Her hands must have clawed at the scarf, desperately trying to loosen it. Her body must have fought for life even as her consciousness faded, and beneath her fingernails she'd collected something. In those final moments as she fought her attacker, her nails had scraped against his skin. Tiny pieces of biological material were trapped there, evidence so small it was nearly invisible. In 1973, that evidence couldn't tell investigators much. DNA analysis was in its infancy. The genetic material was carefully preserved, cataloged, and stored, but it couldn't speak. It couldn't point fingers. It was just There. For 45 years it waited in an evidence locker, and then technology caught up. Modern DNA testing could extract information from samples that would have been useless decades earlier. The genetic profile could be analyzed, compared, traced through databases and family trees, and that evidence, collected by Leslie's dying hands, finally spoke. It pointed directly at John Arthur Gettru. At the time of Leslie's murder, John worked as a security guard near the Stanford campus. He would have been familiar with the area, familiar with where students went, familiar with the patterns of foot traffic, the quiet hours, the isolated spots where someone could be attacked without witnesses. He knew those hills. He'd admitted as much. He'd hiked them with his scout troop. He knew the trails. He knew the remote areas. He knew where a body could be left. Now, in the interrogation room, John studies the photograph of Leslie Perloff. His face shows nothing. No recognition, no emotion, just blank neutrality. He doesn't know her, he claims. Never seen her before. The name Leslie Perloff means nothing to him. But then something strange happens, something that reveals a crack in John's careful facade. As Sergeant Cortez continues his questioning, carefully probing for information, John makes an offhand comment that stops the sergeant cold. He mentions that Leslie looks like she'd be about 18 years old. Looking at the photo, trying to estimate her age. Then he adds, almost as an afterthought, that she's probably a Stanford graduate. The sergeant's expression doesn't change, but his mind is suddenly racing. He never said Leslie was a Stanford graduate. He'd mentioned she was a college student. He'd asked if John knew the Stanford area, but he hadn't specified where Leslie went to school or what her educational background was, so how does John know she graduated from Stanford? John realizes his mistake almost immediately. You can see it in his eyes, a flash of something. Panic, calculation. He quickly tries to cover, explaining that he just assumed it based on how she dressed, based on the area, based on something, anything other than personal knowledge. But the damage is done. The sergeant has noticed. He files it away in his mind, adding it to the growing list of inconsistencies and suspicious responses. The questioning continues, but the dynamic has shifted. The sergeant knows now that John is hiding something. The challenge is getting him to admit it. He asks John about his capacity for violence. Would he ever think about committing a sexual assault? About strangling a young woman? John denies it all. He has no reason to do such things, he insists. He's not that kind of person. Never has been. But his record says otherwise. The German conviction, the California assault. The pattern is undeniable. Then comes the crucial question, the one that will determine the direction of the entire interrogation. If your DNA is on Leslie Perloff's body, how would you explain that? John has no answer. Or rather, he has no good answer. He sits in silence for a moment, his mind clearly working through the implications. The sergeant decides to help him out, asking what John knows about DNA transfer. How does genetic material move from one person to another? John mentions the obvious sources: semen, saliva, the biological fluids that anyone would think of. He seems to be fishing, trying to understand exactly what evidence they have against him, what they can prove, how strong their case is. His mind is still in strategy mode, still calculating, still trying to find a way out, and then John makes his second critical mistake, the one that will ultimately unravel everything. He mentions these two persons. The sergeant's attention sharpens immediately. Two persons? He's only shown John one photograph, only mentioned one victim, only discussed one case: Leslie Perloff. What second person is John referring to? The question hangs in the air like smoke. John realizes what he said, and again there's that flash in his eyes. He tries to backtrack. He mentions the girl in the hills. But the sergeant has only discussed one girl in the hills, one victim, one case. Unless John knows something he shouldn't. Unless he's aware of another victim, another body, another young woman who met the same fate as Leslie Perloff. The sergeant presses the point. What second person? Where did that come from? John fumbles for an explanation. He must have misunderstood the questions. He must have gotten confused. The sergeant must have mentioned 2 people at some point. But they both know that's not true. And in that moment, John has revealed that his knowledge extends beyond what an innocent man would know. He knows about both victims. What Sergeant Cortez hasn't yet explicitly revealed to John is that there was indeed a second victim. Another young woman. Another life cut short in almost exactly the same way. Her name was Janet Ann Taylor, and like Leslie Perloff, she was 21 years old when she died. Young, full of potential. Beloved by her family and friends. Janet's body was found 1 year after Leslie's, in 1974. The location was almost identical. Sand Hill Road in the same Stanford Dish hiking area where Leslie had been discovered. The same beautiful isolated trails. The same coastal hills. And the method was the same. Sexual assault, strangulation. A young woman attacked by someone who saw her as nothing more than an object for his violent fantasies. For decades, investigators had suspected these murders were connected. The similarities were too striking to ignore. Same age range, same general location, same method of killing, same time period. They were looking at a serial killer, someone who had found a type of victim he preferred. Young women, probably in their early 20s. Intelligent, educated, with their lives ahead of them. Someone who knew the Stanford area well enough to know where he could attack without being seen. Someone who had access to those hiking trails and knew which ones were remote enough for his purposes. Someone like John Arthur Gautreau. The DNA technology that had matched John to Leslie's murder was now being applied to Janet's case. The evidence from her body was being tested, analyzed, compared against John's genetic profile. But the investigators didn't have those results yet when John sat down in the interrogation room. They had enough to arrest him for Leslie's murder. The Janet Taylor case was still being processed, still working its way through the forensic analysis. Yet John had mentioned 2 victims, without being prompted, without being told there was a second case. How did he know? The sergeant decides to confront John more directly now. The conversational tone begins to harden. The evidence is laid out plainly. Your DNA is on Leslie Perloff's body. We're not trying to find out who did it anymore. We know who did it. What we're trying to understand is why. John's denials grow weaker, less convincing. He wishes he knew what happened, he claims. But the words ring hollow. They're the words of someone saying what they think they should say, not the words of genuine confusion or innocence. At this point, another investigator joins the interrogation. The pressure intensifies. 2 voices instead of 1. 2 sets of eyes watching every micro-expression. 2 minds working to break down John's carefully constructed walls. They tell John plainly, "You committed this crime. We know you committed this crime." The evidence is overwhelming. What we're giving you now is an opportunity to explain, to tell your side of the story, to help us understand why. But John continues to deny everything. He cycles through different tactics. Confusion, hurt feelings, indignation. But underneath it all is a core of calculation. He's still thinking strategically, still trying to find the best way to protect himself. And then he says something that reveals more than he intends. He'd known this day was coming, he admits. He'd been wondering why it took so long. The investigators pause at this admission. How does an innocent man know that police will eventually come for him? How does someone who didn't commit a crime anticipate arrest? The answer is simple. They don't. John Arthur Gautreau had been waiting for this day for 45 years. Waiting for the knock on the door. Waiting for technology to catch up with his past. Waiting for the evidence to finally speak. And now it has. As the interrogation continues, John's attempts to maintain his innocence become increasingly desperate and contradictory. His carefully rehearsed denials begin to fall apart under sustained pressure. He keeps referring to multiple victims without being prompted. He mentions details about the locations that suggest familiarity beyond what he should have. His explanations become more convoluted, more difficult to follow. When the investigators bring up the German case again, trying to establish a pattern of behavior, John initially says he didn't kill any girl. The denial is absolute. Then he catches himself and corrects the statement. That was different, he says. He was only 18, as if age somehow changes the fundamental nature of what happened to Margaret Williams. But wait. Throughout this entire interrogation, John has maintained his innocence in Margaret's murder. He said repeatedly that he was wrongly convicted, that he didn't do it, that it was a miscarriage of justice. Now he's saying it was different because of his age. That's not the statement of an innocent man. That's the statement of someone who's lost track of which version of the story he's telling. The investigators seize on this contradiction. They lay out the pattern plainly, forcing John to confront the accumulation of evidence across decades. A 15-year-old girl ends up dead in Germany, sexually assaulted and strangled. John says he wasn't there, but he's convicted and serves time. Years pass. John returns to America. A teenage girl is sexually assaulted and strangled in California. John says he didn't do it, but he's convicted and serves time. More years pass. John continues living in the Bay Area. A 21-year-old woman ends up dead, sexually assaulted and strangled. John says he wasn't there, but his DNA is at the scene. Another 21-year-old woman ends up dead, sexually assaulted and strangled. Same location, same method. John says he wasn't there, but his DNA is being tested against evidence from that scene too. What are the odds, the investigators ask, that an innocent man would be connected to this many similar crimes? What are the chances that it's all just coincidence? John's response is revealing. He describes a brick wall. The investigators couldn't find out what really happened all those years ago, so they stopped looking. They gave up, but that's not what happened. The investigators didn't give up. They didn't stop looking. The case remained open all these years, waiting for technology to provide answers. And now technology has provided those answers. The DNA doesn't lie. It doesn't forget. It doesn't change its story, it simply is. One investigator leans forward, his voice carrying a note of something almost like compassion. It must be quite a burden, he suggests, carrying these secrets for so many years, knowing what really happened, living with that knowledge every day, watching Leslie's and Janet's families suffer without answers while John went about his normal life. The weight of decades of deception, the constant fear of discovery, the need to maintain the mask at all times. It must have been exhausting, but John has reached his limit. He's done talking. He's done explaining. He's done trying to navigate the minefield of questions and evidence. He invokes his right to an attorney. 5 words that bring the interrogation to an immediate halt. I'd like a lawyer. The investigators have no choice but to stop. They thank John for his time, inform him of what happens next, and prepare to process him into the jail system. The interrogation is over, but the case is far from closed. 74-year-old John Arthur Guthrie was booked into Santa Clara County Jail on charges of murder. His bond was set at $10 million, an amount that ensured he wasn't going anywhere. The man who had lived free for decades after Leslie Perloff's murder would now spend his remaining days behind bars. In January of 2019, the results came back on Janet Taylor's case. The DNA from the torn crotch of her underwear, preserved carefully for 45 years, was analyzed using modern techniques. It was a match for John Arthur Guthrie. The 2 murders were definitively linked. Same killer, same methods, same hunting ground. The investigators had been right all along. These weren't isolated incidents. They were the work of a serial predator who had operated with impunity for decades. The wheels of justice, though slow, were finally turning at full speed. In September of 2021, John Arthur Guthrie's trial began for the murder of Janet Ann Taylor. The courtroom was packed with people who had waited decades for this moment. Janet's family, Leslie's family, members of the community who remembered when these young women disappeared. Reporters covering a case that had finally come to resolution. The prosecution presented their case methodically. DNA evidence, timeline analysis, pattern of behavior stretching across decades and continents. Expert witnesses explained how genetic material transfers, how it can be preserved, how modern technology can extract information from samples that were useless 40 years ago. The defense tried to create reasonable doubt. They questioned the reliability of decades-old evidence. They suggested contamination. They pointed out that DNA evidence alone doesn't prove murder, only contact. But the pattern was undeniable. The jury saw it. Everyone in that courtroom saw it. After deliberation, they returned with their verdict. Guilty of first-degree murder with infliction of great bodily injury in the killing of 21-year-old Janet Ann Taylor. The sentence was 7 years to life in prison. At 76 years old, John would never see freedom again. But the prosecutors weren't finished. Leslie Perloff's family deserved justice too. They deserved to hear John admit what he'd done. They deserved closure after 48 years of questions. In January of 2023, rather than face another trial, John Arthur Gautreaux pleaded guilty to the murder of Leslie Marie Perloff. A second life sentence was handed down, to be served consecutively with the first. The courtroom was silent as the judge pronounced sentence. 2 young women, 2 families, 2 lives stolen, and 2 families forever changed. Justice had finally arrived, nearly half a century late. John was led away in shackles. The man who had once been trusted with young people. The security guard who was supposed to keep others safe. The husband and father who had seemed so normal to everyone who knew him. All of it had been a facade. A carefully maintained disguise hiding a monster who preyed on vulnerable young women. On September 22, 2023, John Arthur Gautreaux died of natural causes in prison. He was 79 years old. He'd spent less than 4 years behind bars for crimes that had haunted investigators and families for nearly 50 years. Some might say he got off easy. That death was a mercy he didn't deserve, that he should have suffered for decades the way his victims' families had suffered. But perhaps there's justice in the fact that his final years were spent in prison, his reputation destroyed, his carefully constructed life revealed as the lie it always was. Everyone finally knew what he was, what he'd always been. His death closed the chapter on a serial killer who had operated across decades and continents. Margaret Williams in Germany, murdered at 15. Leslie Perloff in California, murdered at 21. Janet Taylor in California, murdered at 21. 3 young women with their entire lives ahead of them. 3 futures stolen by the same hands. Margaret should have graduated high school, maybe gone to college, maybe gotten married, had children, lived a full life. Instead, she was left on a baseball diamond, her life stolen at 15. Leslie had graduated from Stanford, one of the world's great universities. She was building her career, exploring her options, discovering who she wanted to be. Instead, she was found in the hills above campus, a floral scarf around her neck. Janet was 21, the same age as Leslie, another young woman with dreams and ambitions, another life cut brutally short by someone who saw women as objects, rather than human beings. But even in death, John's presence continues to serve justice in an unexpected way. His DNA remains in the state database, stored permanently. And that database is constantly being compared against evidence from unsolved murders across California and beyond. Cold cases that have sat dormant for years are being reopened. Evidence is being retested. Family trees are being traced. And somewhere in those databases, there may be more connections waiting to be discovered. More victims, more families searching for answers, more cases that can finally be solved because John's genetic profile is available for comparison. The technology that caught him continues to work, continues to speak for victims who can no longer speak for themselves. The case of John Arthur Gautreaux forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about justice, about the faces that evil can wear, and about the systems that failed repeatedly to protect the vulnerable. For 45 years after Leslie's murder, John lived as a free man. He went to work every day. He came home to his wife. He raised his children. He attended family gatherings. He was someone's neighbor, someone's coworker, someone's father. No one suspected. Or if they did suspect something was off about him, they didn't suspect this. They didn't imagine that the man grilling hamburgers at the neighborhood barbecue had strangled multiple young women to death. The banality of evil, Hannah Arendt called it. The way that monstrous acts can be committed by people who seem utterly ordinary. John didn't look like a monster. He looked like everybody else, and that's perhaps the most frightening part of this story. There was no way to look at John Arthur Gautreaux and know what he was. No mark of Cain on his forehead. No obvious sign that would warn potential victims to stay away. He looked safe, normal, trustworthy enough to be given responsibility for young people in the Boy Scouts, reliable enough to work security, ordinary enough to blend into suburban life without raising suspicion. The families of his victims waited decades for answers. They buried their daughters without knowing who had taken them. They marked birthdays that would never be celebrated. They grew old, while their daughters remained forever young in photographs and memories. For Leslie's family, 48 years passed between her murder and John's conviction. 48 years of wondering, questioning, hoping that somehow, someday, they would get answers. For Janet's family, 47 years of the same torture. The same endless questions with no answers. For Margaret's family in Germany, 60 years have passed since her murder. 60 years. That's a lifetime. Everyone who knew Margaret as a living, breathing person is elderly now or has passed away themselves. She's become a memory of a memory. And they all had to watch as John was released early, given light sentences, allowed to continue living his life while their daughters were gone forever. The justice system failed catastrophically in John's case over and over again. Each failure created an opportunity for him to reoffend. Each light sentence sent the message that his crimes weren't really that serious. In Germany, he was convicted of murdering a 15-year-old girl, sexually assaulting and strangling a child. The sentence? 10 years, and he served only 6. 6 years for taking a child's life. Then he was released, sent back to America, and allowed to start over as if nothing had happened. In California, he was convicted of sexually assaulting and strangling a teenager while threatening to kill her. The sentence? 6 months, reduced to 30 days served on weekends. 30 days. Less time than most people spend on vacation in a given year. What message does that send to a predator? What lesson does John Arthur Getreu learn from these experiences? He learns that the system isn't serious about punishing him. He learns that he can commit violent crimes and receive minimal consequences. He learns that if he's careful, if he chooses his victims wisely, if he doesn't leave obvious evidence, he can get away with almost anything. And so he did. For decades. How many other potential victims might have been saved if the German sentence had been longer? If he'd served his full 10 years? If he'd been closely monitored after release? How many women might have been spared if the California sentence had been more than 30 days? If he'd been registered as a sex offender and monitored? If the pattern had been recognized? We can't know. But we know that Leslie Perloff and Janet Taylor might still be alive if the system had done its job the first time. Or the second time. They would be in their 70s now. Retired perhaps. Grandmothers. Still contributing to their communities. Still loving and being loved. Instead, they were dead by 21, and their killer walked free for decades afterward. But this case also demonstrates something revolutionary and hopeful. The power of modern forensic science to reach back through time and deliver justice that once seemed impossible. The DNA that caught John Arthur Getreu had been sitting in evidence storage since 1973. For decades, it was just biological material that couldn't tell investigators anything useful. The technology to analyze it properly didn't exist yet. Detectives in the 70s did everything they could with the tools available to them. They interviewed witnesses. They followed leads. They developed theories. But without DNA analysis, they couldn't definitively identify the killer. So the evidence sat and waited, year after year, decade after decade. Through technological revolutions and social changes, through the rise of computers and the internet, through countless advances in every field of science, and finally, the technology caught up to the evidence. Modern DNA testing can extract information from samples that would have been useless in previous decades. The genetic profile can be determined with extraordinary precision. And then that profile can be compared against databases containing millions of genetic records. Not just criminal databases, but the genealogy websites where ordinary people voluntarily upload their DNA, hoping to find distant relatives or learn about their ancestral origins. They have no idea they're also building a tool for justice. Through these databases, investigators can construct family trees. They can identify second cousins and third cousins. They can narrow down the pool of suspects until they find the right person. It's like having a witness who never forgets, never lies, never misremembers. The DNA simply is. It tells the truth about who was present at a crime scene, whose biological material was transferred to a victim. Leslie Perloff's fingernails scraped against her attacker in those final moments. She fought back. She struggled. And in doing so, she collected the evidence that would, 45 years later, identify her killer. In a very real sense, she never stopped fighting. Her body preserved the truth until science could finally hear it. Because of John's arrest and conviction, investigators are now looking at other unsolved cases from the same time period and geographic area. The Bay Area in the 1960s and 70s had numerous unsolved murders of young women. Some of those cases share similarities with Leslie's and Janet's murders. Young women attacked in isolated areas, sexual assault, strangulation, bodies left in locations where John was known to frequent. Could he have been responsible for more murders than the 3 we know about? It's entirely possible. Serial killers rarely stop at just a few victims. They escalate. They become more confident. They develop methods that work for them. John had access to the Stanford area for years. He knew the hiking trails intimately from his time as a scout leader. He worked nearby as a security guard. He was familiar with student patterns and behaviors, and he had a type. Young women in their late teens or early 20s, educated, probably trusting, at least initially. Women who wouldn't necessarily be suspicious of an older man asking for directions or offering help. How many times did he strike and not get caught? How many victims are there that we don't know about? His DNA is now being compared against evidence from every unsolved murder in California's database. And not just California. Other states are looking too. The military base in Germany where Margaret was killed has been contacted. International databases are being searched. Cold cases that seemed permanently unsolved are being given new life. Evidence is being retested. Families who gave up hope decades ago are receiving phone calls from investigators. Some of those cases will turn out to be unrelated to John, but some might not be. Some might reveal that the monster who was finally caught had been far more prolific than anyone realized. Tonight, somewhere in America, there's a person sleeping in their bed. They're elderly now, retired. Maybe they have grandchildren. Maybe they're seen as a pillar of their community. But decades ago, they did something terrible. They hurt someone. They killed someone. And they got away with it. For years they've been waiting, listening for the knock on the door, watching the news for stories about cold cases being solved, feeling their stomach drop every time they see an article about DNA databases and genealogy websites leading to arrests. They thought they were safe. Enough time had passed. The evidence was old. The witnesses were dead or had forgotten. The case was cold. But the evidence remembers. The DNA doesn't forget. And one day, maybe tomorrow, maybe next year, maybe a decade from now, there will be a knock on their door. Maybe it'll be an undercover officer with a story about a fender bender. Maybe it'll be a straightforward approach. But the result will be the same. The past will catch up. The secrets will be exposed. Justice, however delayed, will finally arrive. John Arthur Gautreaux lived free for 45 years after murdering Leslie Perloff. 45 years of thinking he'd gotten away with it. 45 years of marriage and family and normal life. Until the morning when an undercover officer knocked on his door with a story about a car accident. The message is clear. There is no statute of limitations on murder. There is no safety in the passage of time. The technology only gets better. The databases only grow larger. The family trees only become more complete. Every DNA sample uploaded to a genealogy website is another connection in the web. Every technological advance makes it easier to extract information from old evidence. Every cold case unit reopened is another chance for justice. The criminals who thought they escaped are living on borrowed time. The knock is coming. They just don't know when. In the end, the case of John Arthur Gautreaux is about more than just one serial killer finally being caught. It's about the evolution of justice, about how science has fundamentally changed our ability to solve crimes and hold perpetrators accountable. It's about victims who never stopped fighting even after death. Leslie's fingernails, Janet's clothing, the biological evidence they inadvertently preserved. These women contributed to their own justice in ways they could never have imagined. It's about families who refused to give up hope, who kept their daughters' cases alive in their hearts, who cooperated with investigators even when it seemed hopeless, who lived to see justice finally delivered. It's about cold case investigators who never stopped working, who kept files that others might have discarded, who recognized that new technology might someday provide answers, who reopened cases that had been closed for decades. It's about the power of persistence, of science, of refusing to accept that some crimes are unsolvable. But it's also about the failures, the light sentences that enabled a predator to keep hunting, the system that valued John's freedom over public safety, the decades that Leslie's and Janet's families spent without answers. We can't undo those failures. We can't bring back the victims. We can't give their families back the decades they lost. But we can learn from them. We can do better. We can take violent crime seriously from the first offense. We can protect potential future victims by removing dangerous predators from society. And we can use every tool at our disposal, including cutting-edge DNA technology, to ensure that the guilty are held accountable even when decades have passed. Margaret Williams, 15 years old, a military dependent living on an American base in Germany. She went to a dance on a Saturday night in 1963. She should have come home safely. She should have lived to graduate high school, to choose her path in life, to become whoever she was meant to be. Instead, she was found on a baseball diamond, her young life stolen by someone who saw her as nothing more than an object for his violent fantasies. Leslie Marie Perloff, 21 years old, a Stanford graduate working as a law clerk, intelligent, ambitious, full of potential. She had a future mapped out ahead of her, filled with possibilities and dreams. Instead, she was found in the hills above campus, a floral scarf around her neck. Her orange Chevrolet Nova abandoned. Her life ended in violence by someone who had been allowed to walk free despite his violent past. Janet Ann Taylor, 21 years old, another young woman with her whole life ahead of her. Another daughter, another friend, another human being who deserved to live and love and grow old. Instead, she was found on Sand Hill Road, another victim of the same predator, another family left with questions, another life stolen. 3 women, 3 families, 3 sets of dreams and hopes and futures that were destroyed by one man's violence. These weren't statistics. They weren't case numbers. They were real people who laughed and cried and loved, who had favorite songs and foods, who had inside jokes with their friends, who made their parents proud, who had so much living left to do. They deserve to be remembered as more than just victims. They were Margaret, Leslie, Janet. They were daughters and friends and bright young women who should have lived long, full lives. Instead, their stories ended far too soon, in violence and darkness. But because of modern DNA technology, their deaths were not in vain. The evidence they left behind finally spoke. Justice, though delayed, finally arrived, and their killer finally faced consequences for what he'd done. It's not enough. It can never be enough. Nothing can restore what was taken, but it's something. John Arthur Gertrude died in prison at 79 years old. His name will be forgotten by most people. He'll become just another case study in criminal justice textbooks, just another serial killer who was finally caught. But Margaret, Leslie, and Janet should not be forgotten. They should be remembered for who they were, not just how they died, for their potential, for their humanity, for the light they brought into the world during their 2 short lives. And their cases should serve as a reminder that cold cases are never truly closed, that evidence waits patiently for technology to catch up, that families deserve answers no matter how much time has passed, that justice, even when delayed for decades, is still worth pursuing. The DNA doesn't forget, the evidence speaks, and the knock on the door will eventually come. For John Arthur Gertrude, that knock came on an ordinary California morning disguised as a minor traffic accident. The careful life he'd built, the mask he'd worn for decades, the secrets he'd kept, all of it crumbled in moments. And finally, after 45 years, Leslie Perloff could rest. After 47 years, Janet Taylor could rest. After 60 years, Margaret Williams could rest. The man who took their lives had finally been held accountable. It wasn't enough, but it was something, and that something matters.